I want to say one more word of welcome. My name is Matt Stone. I'm the lead pastor here, and I want to say again how glad I am to be in worship, how glad we are to be in worship with you this morning as we are in the second week of a series called For Our Neighbors. We talked last week about what it means to rediscover together. I alluded to that earlier in the service, that part of the work that we need to do is work that has to be done together about rediscovering how to be together, how to be a community again. And this is core and central to the gospel, core and central to the lives of followers of Jesus. This week, we're going to travel down a little bit different road. I was recently recommended a book by a guy named Will Guidara, who was the general manager of 11 Madison Park for 11 years. 11 Madison Park is a restaurant in New York City, and the book is the story of his journey towards becoming the best restaurant in the world. He was rated, his restaurant, 11 Madison Park, was rated as the best restaurant in the world. And the path that he takes to get there is by tending not only to the extraordinary quality of the food, but also by tending to a different kind, a desire to make a different kind of impact on the folks who came into his restaurant. And so that's really what much of the book is about. And he the core truth that he hits upon is the idea that the desire, that the human desire to be taken care of never really goes away, that's part of who we are. And so they began to focus intentionally and passionately and wholeheartedly on connection, on graciousness, and on creating a sense of belonging. In other words, hospitality, and that was the path, that was the focus that would carry them, he hoped, into becoming the greatest, the best restaurant in the entire world. And so as they started to talk about hospitality and the difference between what they wanted to do versus what they had done, they kind of broke it up like this. They talked about service was the old way of doing things, and they were great at service. And they were really excellent and efficient at getting the right plate to the right table to the right person. And so that was kind of the low bar, though. That's what they discovered, is that service isn't going to get you to the kind of connection and graciousness and sense of belonging that they desired. And so they began to talk about hospitality. If service was black and white, hospitality is color. This was about engaging the people in front of you so that you can create an authentic kind of connection with them. And that was really a game-changing realization for them. And so as they started to implement this notion of hospitality, what they kept running into was people saying, that's not very realistic. You can't do that. It's not reasonable. And so the unreasonable hospitality became their kind of call to arms. That's the name of the book, Unreasonable Hospitality. That became their call to arms as they traveled on the journey from just sort of a middling three-star, what a sentence, a middling three-star restaurant to the greatest restaurant in the world. And they started in a number of places, but one of the places that they started was by re-examining the transactional nature of the interactions in a restaurant. In other words, I'm going to give you money, you're going to give me food. The reason you're going to be nice to me is because I'm going to give you money at the end of the day. The reason you're going to give me good food is because I'm going to give you money at the end of it. They wanted to re-examine the transactional nature of that interaction because they felt like it was a barrier to what we were talking about: hospitality, connection, graciousness, and a sense of belonging. And so they made some simple changes, like they took the printer of the receipts out of the dining room. You know that sound that it makes, which just reminds you, I'm going to have to pay this and I don't want to pay this. And it breaks up the sense that you are actually in this transactional relationship. They wanted to suspend reality for the duration of the meal. So they took the printer out of the dining room so that we wouldn't have to listen and you wouldn't have to see the bill being printed off. Another thing they did was they created a ticketless coat check. Remember, we're in New York City. They apparently have heavy coats. I don't know. And so the standard would be you come into a restaurant, you hand them your coat so that you don't have to sit on it at your chair. They will give you a ticket at the end of the meal. You give them the ticket back. They give you your coat. Well, they said, that's not really how things happen when we're at home. They started to make this transition to, we want it to feel like somebody's coming to our house. So he said, we're going to do this in a ticketless fashion. They figured out a way so that when somebody comes in, they just handed their coat to somebody who was greeting them. And at the end of their meal, as they were walking out, somehow, magically, that coat, your coat, would be there waiting for you on your way out. Another thing that they did was they removed the maitre d's table, the host or hostess table or podium that usually greets you when you walk in the door, right? You walk in, someone's standing behind this podium with a light looking very official and stuffy, says, "Do you have a reservation?" And you say, "Yes, I have a reservation for 7:45, and they say, "What's your name?" And then they tell you whether the table's ready. Well, they wanted to do away with that because when you're at home, you don't greet somebody by saying, "Hello, do you have a reservation?" Right? You've invited them into your home, and so you're going to open the door and greet them and welcome them in. So they felt like that maitre d's table was a physical barrier to creating a hospitable, an unreasonably hospitable interaction at the front door. So they took it away so that you could be greeted warmly like you might be at home. And the more they did this, the more the staff really kind of took it to the next level. They took it from reasonable to unreasonable. Those things that we were talking about, the printer, the coat check, the maitre d's table, all those could be classified in the reasonable category, but they just kept pushing the boundaries that we would normally expect in a restaurant. So now, the next kind of evolution was that when you made a reservation, you, of course, have to give them your name. You would give them your name. And before you arrived, their staff, this does move borderline creepy, perhaps, but their staff would research you online. It's amazing what Google will tell you. They would look for any pictures of you online, any relevant biographical information. And the reason was, when they greeted you at the door, not behind a table, but when they opened the door, when the maitre d' opened the door, they wanted the maitre d' to be able to greet you by name without asking your name and be able to say, "Oh, happy birthday, Mr. Smith. We're so glad that you joined us. Oh, happy anniversary, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. We're so glad that you're celebrating this evening with us," without asking any of those details. They wanted it to feel not transactional, but relational. That's how they took it from reasonable to unreasonable. A great example was at the end of the meal, right? Everybody moves at a different pace. Some people, when they're finished with the meal and the check is brought, they want to pay it, they want to get out because they got something else to do. Other people, when the check is set down, there's no real acknowledgement of it, and they stay for another 2 hours. Well, the restaurant wanted that to not be hurried along, but they also didn't want to push people out. And so what they did, I think there's some real genius in this, perhaps. What they did was to bring, with the check, they brought a bottle of complimentary cognac, and they put it down at the table and said, "Stay as long as you want." Now, I can see how that might create some problems, but the idea was you can't possibly feel hurried out if somebody sets down this entire thing and says, "Hey, stay as long as you want." I love how that's entirely unreasonable, and the staff just kept going with it. They noticed one night that a group of 4 guys came in, and as they were listening to them talk, they realized that these were 4 foodies from somewhere in the Midwest. They had come to New York to visit all the great restaurants in New York. They were there on their last day. They were going to the airport after this meal. And one of them said, and their waiter was listening, one of them said, "About the only thing we didn't eat in New York was a New York City street hot dog." And so Will Guidara, the author, the general manager, was standing by, heard his waiter make that report, and he says that a light bulb goes off in his head, and he takes off running down the street. Now, if the earlier example was borderline creepy, this is borderline weird. So he takes off running down the street, and he buys what he calls a dirty water dog. Did you know that's what they call them? Ugh, that's disgusting. He buys a dirty water dog off some street vendor in New York City, takes it back to one of the finest restaurants in the world, takes it to the chef of one of the finest restaurants in the world, unwraps this dirty water dog and says, "Hey, I need you to put this on the plate." And the chef says, no, because the chef had sense. But Will Guidara says, "Look, just trust me." So the chef cuts it up into 4 evenly sectioned off pieces, puts a flare of mustard and a flash of ketchup and a dollop of relish on it, puts it on these pristine white plates at one of the finest restaurants in the world, and they carry it out to this table of 4 guys who have been in every nice restaurant in New York City, and they set down in front of them a $2 hot dog, and they lost their minds. They thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And take note of a couple things. It didn't cost $2. It didn't cost anything to the restaurant. All that it took was listening and responding. The more they learned about unreasonable hospitality, the more they realized, yes, sometimes they spent money, but most of the time, what it took was listening and responding, paying attention to what people were talking about and engaging them in an authentic sort of interaction. Another great example was a couple comes in and they're talking with their waiter and they mention that it's their 17th or 27th anniversary, I can't remember which, and they were talking about the song that they danced to at their wedding. Well, the waiter arranged for, at the end of their meal, as they're toasting with champagne to their anniversary, their latest anniversary, they arranged for that song to be played in the restaurant so that they could have a dance just like they shared at their wedding, 20 years earlier. It didn't cost the restaurant anything. It wasn't an extravagant, over-the-top step. It was a simple gesture because they were listening and they put a little bit of effort into it and responded and created a moment that couple is going to remember for the rest of their lives. Another great example is a guy comes in, he's been trying to raise money for some venture capital, whatever it is, and it's not going well, and everybody kind of realizes that he's the last guy at the table, and the waiter asks him if he needs anything else, and he says, yeah, you got $1 million? And so the waiter leaves the table and runs down the street and buys 10 100-gram bars and brings them and puts them on a plate and gives them to the guy, which didn't really help him. But it was a moment that he remembered for the rest of his life. And it's a moment that began to shape how they thought about the people around them. It was a simple gesture. It didn't cost a lot of money. All that it required was listening, paying attention, a little bit of effort, and the desire to create a connection with the people around them. Will Guidara ends up reclaiming hospitality in such a way that it propels him towards becoming the world's greatest restaurant on the list of top 50 greatest restaurants in the world. It was unreasonable hospitality that took them to the top. Now, after reading the book, and it's a phenomenal book, it's entertaining. I would not have guessed that I would enjoy reading a book about, restaurant hospitality. But it was a great book. But at the end of the book, I left thinking, I'm not sure that even Will Guidara gets the full message here. I'm not sure that even he understands exactly the power that he is talking about in this notion of unreasonable hospitality. And I can't help but thinking that for us as a church, there is something in there. But unreasonable hospitality, I don't think is quite right. That's not quite the right framing. Because after all, as a church or as a community, we're not a fine dining establishment. We don't offer a menu for folks to come in and consume whatever it is that they want to consume before paying the bill and leave. That's not quite the right model for who we are as a community of faith. So perhaps if we change the frame just a bit from unreasonable hospitality to unreasonable neighboring, then we might get somewhere, because we find in that notion something that Jesus displays in spades and a story that is replayed over and over again in Scripture. Unreasonable hospitality. Now take note, that's not nice neighboring. Unreasonable neighboring is not nice neighboring. Nice neighboring is the baseline bar, right? We should be able to at least be nice neighbors. And if you're not a nice neighbor, then check your heart, because you need to at least don't be that guy. We should at least be able to be nice neighbors. But that really doesn't fulfill the commandment that Jesus says is the most important thing. He doesn't say, love God and be nice neighbors. He says, love God and love your neighbor. That's a pretty high bar that I think unreasonable neighboring starts to kind of scratch below the surface at what that might actually look like. So there's a story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 3 of the Gospels, that I think illustrates this point really, really well. We're going to look in Mark chapter 2. If you have your Bible and you want to turn to Mark chapter 2, you can do that right now. Later on, I'd encourage you to go read the same story in Matthew chapter 9 or in Luke chapter 5. But in Mark chapter 2 is where we're going to read it. And it's a story that unfolds in a place called Capernaum. Capernaum is on the north part of Israel. It's just north of the Sea of Galilee. It's a very, very small town. And you need to know a little bit of something about construction in Capernaum before we dive into this story. I know it sounds weird, but just stick with me for a minute. We're going somewhere, I promise. So most of the rock, in other words, the material used to construct buildings in ancient Israel around Capernaum, most of the rock in that area is basalt rock. It's a volcanic rock that's relatively light, pretty easy to mine. It just has one problem. When you get segments of rock over 4 feet long, it tends to crack. So they have to use relatively small blocks, which means that most of the construction in first century Capernaum is low one-story structures. And there was kind of a standard house in Capernaum at the time that looked like this. It was built around a courtyard. And remember, you don't have just one nuclear family living together. You have extended families who all live in the same place. The courtyard was the main gathering place for the family, is where you did your cooking, where you did your eating, where you did your whatever gathering you're going to do as a family. All that took place in the courtyard. Around the courtyard was a low wall that contained smaller windowless rooms. So at night, each individual family, each nuclear family would retreat into their own room on the outside of that courtyard. Our story takes place in that kind of room. Over the low one-story walls would be some timber. They would lay timbers across it, and then they would use mud and leaves of various natures to create a more or less waterproof ceiling or roof so they don't get wet at night, and that would require some regular maintenance that was a normal part of life in the first century in Israel. So now you know a little bit about construction in first century Capernaum. Now it's time to dive into what happens in Mark chapter 2 in verse 1. When Jesus returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. Capernaum is more or less Jesus' hometown. He grew up in Nazareth, but as he moves into his adult years, into his ministry life, he moves over to the Sea of Galilee, from the interior of Israel to the Sea of Galilee to this place, Capernaum, where he does a huge percentage of his ministry. So he's returning home. So many gathered around him that there was no longer room for him, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Luke tells us that this is a collection of not just folks who live in Capernaum, although they're there too, but folks from all over Israel, Pharisees and teachers from all over Israel, have come to hear, what is this guy talking about? What is this guy doing? We've heard some things, but we want to hear him. We want to hear for ourselves what Jesus has to say. So they've all gathered in this house that we've been talking about. It sounds like they have moved back into one of those rooms for what started as a smaller conversation, but so many people gather around it, now they're crowded out of the door. Then some people came, bringing to Jesus a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. And when they couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. So I was always very concerned about this story as a kid, and when I was hearing it as a younger man, because it sounds like a huge mess that they're making. I did not understand, why are you tearing off this guy's roof just to get him in front of Jesus? I was very concerned about the mess. I think there's probably some psychological things going on there, but we can delve into that at a later time. So I was always worried about the mess, but it turns out this was not so abnormal. Remember, roof maintenance is a normal course action. This is just something that people have to do. So you don't have to worry. The roof is going to be okay in the end. They dig through it. They are not deterred by any of 3 things. They're not deterred by the Pharisees and the scribes, right? These are the power players in ancient Israel. They're not deterred by them. These 4 guys who carry this paralytic man are not deterred by the size of the crowd. They don't care how many people were there. They did not let that stop them. They were not deterred by the physical barrier that lay between them and Jesus, right? The roof, they just dug through it. They were unreasonable in their pursuit of putting this guy in front of Jesus. And by the way, almost every time that I've heard this story told, almost every time that I read the story for myself, I always inserted the idea that these guys were the paralytic's friends, right? Surely these are friends who do this for this paralyzed man. But the text never says friends. Here's part of what's happening. Capernaum is a very small town. I think if they were friends, we would have been told that this guy's friends took him to Jesus. I don't know that they were friends, but they were definitely at least neighbors, right? You can't live in Capernaum and not know more or less who every person is. They were at least neighbors. These unreasonable neighbors were unrelenting in their desire to solve the access problem. This paralytic man had a problem. He did not have access to Jesus, and his unreasonable neighbors solved that problem on his behalf. They made it possible for this man to be in front of Jesus, and that's when the real action of the story begins, right? All of that is set up. But take note, it is the unreasonable neighboring that creates the context in which this paralytic man can encounter Jesus. So listen to what Jesus has to say to this guy. When Jesus saw their faith, I got to tell you about this. Mrs. Ginger would be so proud of me. Mrs. Ginger was my 7th grade grammar teacher. I hated her. She made us have a pronoun test one time where we had to memorize all of the pronouns, and I thought that was a dumb assignment, so I didn't study and got a 42 on the test. And on the back of my report card, which I found last week, she wrote, "Matt has a bad attitude," which I'm not going to tell my children about. So anyways, turns out Mrs. Ginger was right. Grammar matters. Did you notice the pronoun that he used? When Jesus saw their faith, it's not even just the faith of the paralytic. When Jesus saw their faith, it is the faith of the neighbors who bring this man before Jesus that Jesus sees and responds to. Isn't that fascinating? Listen now to what Jesus has to say. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And isn't that not what we expect? That's not what Jesus was supposed to say. He was supposed to say, "Son, get up, you are healed." But he says instead, "Son, your sins are forgiven," because Jesus sees the sin problem that nobody else sees. Right? Jesus sees the deeper issue that prevents this man from being who God made him to be, from having the kind of relationship with his maker that God desired. Jesus sees that problem and solves it, not only for this man, but for all of us. Jesus sees the sin problem and the sin barrier and says, "Your sins are forgiven." And then everybody starts grumbling. "Who do you think you are?" That's what they say. "Who do you think you are? You don't have the authority to do that. Only God can forgive sin. Who do you think you are?" And Jesus, in return, I love this. He gets a little testy, which I always kind of like my Jesus a little testy, because this is what he says. "Why are you raising such questions in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up, take your mat, and walk'? But look, so that you might know that the Son of Man," he's talking about himself, "so that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he says to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And everybody sees the man stand up and walk away, and everybody walks away amazed. The real action of the story is Jesus rightly seeing that the sin of this man keeps him from being who God made him to be, and so Jesus solves that problem. But that interaction doesn't take place without the unreasonable neighboring that led to the opportunity for Jesus to work. I love that concept. I love that notion that it is the four guys' commitment to remove all barriers, to just keep pursuing access to Jesus on behalf of their paralyzed friends. I love that as a model for what it means for us to be not nice neighbors, because anybody can do that. We need to be unreasonable neighbors. Frankly, I got to tell you, I'm tired of being reasonable. I'm tired of being reasonable because nobody else is. Nobody is committed to being reasonable in this world at this time. They're not being reasonable about what they believe or how they talk or how they behave. Nobody is committed to reasonable action or speech, and I don't think we ought to be either. I think it's probably time for us as followers of Jesus to stop being reasonable in service of our faith. It's probably time for us to be unreasonable about putting our faith into action. Our culture might tell us that our neighbors are to be feared. They're to be kept at arm's length. They're to be confined or restricted or degraded. They're to be ignored. That might be what our culture tells us in so many different ways. But it is past time for us to be unreasonable in pursuit of our neighbors, not keeping them at arm's length. It's funny because my neighbors are actually teaching me this, much to my chagrin. As much talking about neighboring as we've done this year, and I know we've done a lot, as much talking about that as we've done, it's my neighbors who are teaching me a lot about this. Margaret, I don't know, bought Amazon 3 weeks ago. At least that's what it felt like. And so we had 4 tons of cardboard to get rid of, and we filled our poor recycling bin, we filled it up, and we didn't even make a dent in it. And we were trying to figure out, you know what the problem, like you know that problem, trying to figure out what do we do with all this stuff. Well, the next day, we just kind of stacked it outside. Well, the next day, one of our neighbors brought their recycling bin from their house down the street. It's about 1/10 of a mile down the street. They brought it from their street up the hill to our house and put it in our driveway. Didn't say anything to us, just left it there for us to use. Isn't that interesting? That didn't take any money on her part. All that it took was her paying attention and then putting a little bit of effort into responding to a need that she knew that we had. It's a small thing, but it made an impact. Nobody's ever done that before, and I can't tell you how many times my wife has bought Amazon before. I thought it was fantastic. Another time, we were sitting out in the backyard for about 30 minutes, and another neighbor of mine texts me and sends me a screenshot of Facebook with a picture of a dog and says, "Is this your dog?" And it was my dog, who was in the yard with us, I thought. Our neighbor sent the picture to us. His neighbor from another neighborhood sent the picture to him, said, "Hey, do you know this dog?" Their neighbor was sent that picture from a third neighbor. It's like 3 degrees of unreasonable neighboring separation. It was a third neighborhood over. Our dog was, I don't know, half a mile away. I don't know what this dog was doing. But they brought the dog back. All that it took was paying attention. All that it took was asking a question, sending a text, and being willing to put the effort forward to create the opportunity for us to be reunited with our poor dog, our poor dumb dog. It's fascinating to learn how little it actually takes to do something that makes a profound difference in somebody else's life. This is also something that we're starting to hear from y'all. We've started to hear some really cool stories about what you guys are experiencing and how you all are, how all y'all are being neighbors right here in Peachtree City. And I wanted you to hear a story from one of you on the screens. Let's watch a video.
Gosh, where did I start? So it just kind of started with a package, really. We noticed some folks moved in across the street, and we, wave in passing, but didn't really get a chance to connect or anything. And just a few months before our 3rd child was born, we noticed that there was a note on the garage across the street from us, and their garage door was cracked. So we just kind of went over and peeked, and it said hey, can you put any packages under the door? And I was like, oh, okay, well, they're out of town. Well, the next day we noticed a big package get delivered, and I realized it was a car seat, and I was like, oh my gosh, she's pregnant. And then the next morning, my husband was walking out to work. He's like, hey, it looks like it's gonna rain. Have you talked to them? I was like, I don't know their names or anything, And I was like, let's take it and move it. I was like, it's a car seat. If it's gonna rain, we don't know how long they're gonna be gone, if it gets moldy or anything like that. So we got some stuff to cover it up and then just tucked it underneath their porch to try and keep any rain and stuff off of it. I ended up sticking just a note in the mailbox, and I was like, hey, if you're out of town again, let us know. We can help just pick up some packages or whatever, just so they don't get ruined, because they don't have a covered porch. Their little daughter was born the week of the 4th of July, and I'd been working. I just was messaging with her and stuff, and she said, hey, are you guys home? We want to bring over something. And I was like, you just had a baby. Why are you bringing us something? And so her husband brought over some baklava, and we found out that part of their culture is that when something exciting happens or they're celebrating something, that they share sweet treats and stuff with family. And we were like, we made the list? We're kind of family, across the street now, So it was really touching. Really, it doesn't take much to be a good neighbor. Even if you aren't sure about some of the people that you might be meeting or who those people are, just a small act of kindness can just really bloom into something so much greater. I have a hard time reaching out sometimes. I'm kind of introverted. that fear of like, oh, maybe they don't like me, they're going to reject me, or we're different, is that going to be okay that we're different? And I know I don't mind if we're different, but some people might feel differently. So there's always that innate fear that, your differences might be a barrier somehow. And so I'm grateful that it hasn't been.
I love that story because it didn't cost, Sarah and her family didn't spend an exorbitant amount of money. It didn't take half of their life to do this thing. It was a simple thing that was made possible because they had their eyes open and they were willing to put forth a little bit of effort on behalf of their neighbors. It is fascinating to watch unreasonable neighboring make family out of those who are not family. I think that's the end game here. The end game is that we are all connected by the one who made us. Neighboring, unreasonable neighboring, facilitates that kind of authentic encounter, engagement, relationship that will make family out of those who are not family. It is past time. It is past time. It is past time for our actions to match our words, for our behavior to match our profession. I know some of you saw the story a couple of weeks ago about the young man who robbed a convenience store with like an AK-47 while he wears a sweatshirt that says, "Love never fails." Friends, that cannot be us. That can't be us. We cannot wear the shirt. Not just, we can't wear the shirt and harm people, or really worse and more realistic for most of us, we can't wear the shirt and be indifferent. Our words and our actions have to match. Otherwise, the words just don't mean anything. It's past time to go beyond the boundaries of reasonable behavior and be unreasonable in our pursuit of the greatest commandment, to love God and to love our neighbor.